Hello and welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. Kingsville author Joan Harder has published her first book titled From Prairie Roots to Lake Erie Shores, My Story in Words. It's a memoir, and since Joan has reached the remarkable age of 90, and wait till you see her, she doesn't look it, she has plenty of stories to tell. Joan's writing reveals her vivid memories of growing up, moving, losing loved ones, and the happiness and joy one can find in every moment. Through the everyday stumbles and challenges of life, Joan keeps a sense of wonder and a determination to be happy. All readers will relate to and appreciate the optimism, irony, humor, and humanity she finds in life. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters.
Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to have you here.
And I'm delighted to be here.
Now, 90 years is a few good years being on the planet. And before we talk about some of the incredible journeys that you've had, that you've written about in this book, I thought maybe I'd love to hear about the changes you've witnessed in 90 years. What were some of the significant changes that you've seen, even from your childhood to maybe being a teenager?
Well, I remember in my childhood, because I came from a very small town, we never had things that entertained us. We found things to entertain. And the things that we thought of were going out, digging graves, looking for old Indian grave burial grounds, which we never found, but we did find the odd arrowhead and things like that. But it kept us busy. And we played kickball, and we did things like, well, it sounds kind of nasty, but we went out drowning gophers. I must say, though, that wasn't very successful, but there was a penny for a tail if you did get one.
What do people use a tail for?
I don't know, but it must have been to get rid of they were just paying to get rid of the gophers, because gophers dug a lot of holes and they wrecked some of the landscape, I guess.
And were they a menace for farmers?
Well, I really honestly don't know, because I never heard the farmers complain about it, but I always knew they were getting rid of the gophers, and they were about the size of a squirrel.
Oh, right. How old were you when the war started?
1939, I was 7.
7. Do you remember what it was like?
I remember seeing my first soldier. He was walking down the street, and he had his uniform on, and he had the things that are around their ankles. And I asked my mom what they were, and she said they were called puttees. And they were part of the soldier's uniform. They protected the ankle, and he wore boots. And that was my first memory. And just before that, King George and Queen Elizabeth had made a trip to Canada and went through Canada by train. And they were going because they had a feeling that if they waited too much longer, that the war may break out.
What was it like in your town during the war years?
Well, I'd moved back and forth in the war years. I was in Provost that year, Provost, Alberta. We just lived there 1 year. And all I knew was that I didn't know anybody in my family that was in the services, because everybody was either too young or too old, apparently. And then most of the wartime, I was in Stettler, Alberta, which was where I actually stayed from the time I was 10 until I was 21.
Were things changed? Were there rations and things like that?
Oh, yes. We had rations. We had war-saving stamps and war-saving certificates. And if you bought a saving stamp, my grandpa would give us pennies or nickels, and we would save up and buy a saving stamp for 5 cents. And then we had books that we could put the stamps in, and when we got the books of stamps, when it got full, it was worth $5, and that was helping the war. And after the war, we got our money back.
Oh, really?
Yes, we got if we bought savings bonds, they paid for the savings bonds, and everything it was an investment. We didn't, as kids, understand that until after the war, when we realized we got $5 for for helping to win the war.
Were they scary times, or were you far enough away from the war?
We were very far from the war because, excuse me, but one thing about the street that I lived on in Stettler, it was lined with flags because nearly every family had a son who was in the war, if they were that age. My dad was older, so he wasn't in the war, but he was busy helping with the farming and stuff like that. But everybody who lost somebody also, there was and there were a lot of losses on our street.
What were some of the significant changes in the world, let's say in the first 50 years of your life?
Well, let's see.
Things that really stood out.
In the first 50 years, I remember things like Elvis.
That's a very good memory, in my opinion.
And we were moving around. We lived in a trailer home because my husband was in the oil exploration business. So one of the things that happened in our part of the country was they discovered oil in Alberta.
And you were there.
And I was there. And the big companies from Texas, Gulf Oil, and they came up with crews, and everybody had to have places to rent because they didn't have places to live. And my dad had a building that he rented out to some of them to store their business things. And he often said if he'd known better, he could have got rich, but he never did because he had a lot. He did have a lot of buildings that they used, and of course there were the high school girls were thrilled because there were some very good-looking young men came up from Texas.
I was going to say, how exciting was it for the townspeople? Yes. Wow. It must be exciting. I mean, in the same way, the Klondike and discovering gold and, to be part of that early exploration must be, really an interesting thing to live through. And
if people just had oil discovered on their land, it was pretty nice.
Yeah. That's one way to get rich.
Right.
Do you remember the first time you saw an airplane?
I can't remember the first time I saw one, but it was probably, it probably would have been in Edmonton because we had a family that moved to northern Alberta and they were homesteading. And that was a momentous thing that our family, anybody who was farmers, had to leave the land in the 30s because they couldn't grow anything. So that happened, and that was sort of before the war started. They all moved away, but I remembered my dad when we drove up there. My dad was a traveler, so he had a car, which was a rare thing in those days, and we always drove up north to northern Alberta in the summer, and he would drop us off at our grandparents' place, and then he would travel on his areas and come back and pick us up and take us home after 2 or 3 weeks. So we had a pretty good life, but we always went by the airport. He took us by the airport so that we could see airplanes.
What did it feel like the first time you saw, as a young person?
Well, it was amazing. You just couldn't believe that they actually flew around.
Yeah. Because, almost everybody alive today, it's just such a normal part of life,
That's
isn't
right.
it?
Yeah.
And television. How old were you when you saw television?
Well, I was married by the time, and that would have been, I was married when I was 21, and we lived in Saskatchewan. And television was just snow. Really, you had, if you have a good day, you would get a picture, but it really wasn't much of anything for quite a few years.
Yeah.
But it was exciting for us because that's the only thing there was.
Mm-hmm. In Newfoundland, you only had one channel for a long time.
Well, I think we had one channel for quite a long time. I remember when we got cable, we didn't even know what cable was, but my gosh, that was wonderful. Then we had 3 channels.
Wow. And now it's endless.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
There are so many really interesting things that you also experienced, and I want to talk about what I did. Was I went in after, as I was reading your book, I picked out little pieces that I thought really told interesting stories, and one was the penny.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, my grandpa Thomas, who was my father's father, was a postmaster when I was little, and we lived in the same yard as the post office. And he was a carpenter, and so he had a carpenter shop on the side of the post office. And we were always up there. And he started giving us a penny a day if we were good and didn't get in any trouble. And the pennies were the big, round, brown pennies. Nothing like what you see today. And you could get quite a bit with it. You could get quite a bit of licorice with a penny, or suckers. So we were, and then again, I don't think very many children that I knew got a penny in those days.
And today there are no pennies.
And there are no pennies. That's right.
Wow.
I've saved a roll. But interestingly enough, someone came to me not too long ago, and he had read my book, and he said, "I have something for you." And he handed me an 1890 brown penny with Queen Victoria's picture on it.
Oh, wow. You must have been thrilled.
I was.
Yeah.
And I knew what it was, but the importance of it at the time when I was young was just because I could get licorice.
Wow. It's amazing how much you could buy for a penny, and today it's so useless they got rid of it.
That's right. Yeah.
That's a huge change, isn't it?
Oh, it's an amazing change. It really is,
I used to babysit. We used to get 10 cents an hour. And if I babysat a few times, I could have a great evening out at the arena.
I don't think you babysat for an oil couple, because I got 25 cents from them, because they were making big money.
Oh no, these were hard rock miners,
but
not the big oil companies.
But it's the change is amazing. Yeah.
It is, and now I don't think you can get a babysitter under $50 an hour.
Well, fortunately, I haven't had to do that for a while.
Now, many people today find that they can't live without 2 bathrooms, but you had an outhouse. Mm-hmm. That was a big change, I bet.
It was. Well, the other thing that was a big change was the tissue, the catalog, the Sears.
Yes.
We were always excited to get the Sears catalog.
Before it went to the outhouse?
Yes, and then at Christmas time, there were they called them Japanese oranges. I guess they came from Japan. I don't really, and they had light orange tissue paper. Well, that we saved that up, and that went to the outhouse.
People don't know how good they have it. I remember when I went to England the first time, they had something called Isel paper, and it was almost like wax paper. I mean, even coming from Newfoundland, I thought that was, pretty bad.
I would say. And nobody liked the colored papers, the colored parts of the catalog, really very much.
Right. And did you have was it the Eaton's catalog?
Eaton's and Simpson's.
That was the expensive one.
It was a bigger catalog, but Simpson's also sent out a catalog.
Yeah.
And at Christmas time, that was exciting.
Well, you know what? That was sort of like the first internet.
I guess it was, yeah.
Right away
exactly.
to the catalog.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just took longer to arrive.
And your mother could put your foot on a piece of paper and trace around it and order shoes.
And something else that I thought was interesting were the traveling clinics. The clinics came to you.
Yeah.
Was that because there was no hospital?
Well, the closest hospital to the town I lived in was about 35 miles, which was quite a distance unless you had a way to get there, and most people didn't. My dad, if he was home, was always taking people back and forth. But I don't think we had that hospital for quite a while because my grandfather was a carpenter, and he always talked about helping build that hospital. So it must have been just before we were born.
Yeah. What was the main mode of transportation?
Horses and wagons.
That must have been so exciting.
And the train. We did have the train. It went back and forth. Yeah. We'd go up one way and down and back the next, so you couldn't go. You had to stay over.
Yeah. It's so exciting, to sort of talk to someone who's actually been in those situations, because you can read about it, but talking about it is so exciting.
It is,
and to remember it so vividly.
We had of course there's no running water. Now there were houses. We did live in a house when I was 7 that had a pump and a cistern under the house, and they used to come along and fill the cisterns with water, and they had a pump. You could pump your own water into a sink or something, which was pretty upscale.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember my grandmother had one, but you had to prime it.
Yes.
You had to put water down and prime it. All your, energy.
That's right. But the other, up until then, there was a pump in the middle of Main Street. And everybody that's wanted for drinking water, they carried their drinking water from the pump. Everybody used the same pump.
Wow.
And you were not allowed to use it for washing your clothes. You had to go to the water that was in the sloughs, or melt snow in the wintertime. And we had big copper boilers that they would fill with water and set on the stove overnight so that it was hot in the morning for washing clothes.
Yeah. And did you have baths in the copper?
We had baths in a round tub.
Yeah.
Yeah, Saturday night.
Yeah.
Kids were well, I think we were first to get bathed, and then whoever.
You were less dirty.
That's right.
And then, of course, your first tragedy, the loss of your mum?
Well, that's the first thing that really hit me. But I did have a little friend when I was 5, and I remember this vividly, that something happened to him, and I think he died of cancer, but I didn't know anything about that right at the time. And I remember my mom taking me to their house because his casket was a little white coffin sitting on the dining room table, and that was where we went to pay our respects.
What was your life like before and after your mum died?
Well, there again, my brother Dave and I were probably the luckiest kids, because my mom got breast cancer, And she had to go to a place called Macklin, Saskatchewan, because that was the closest hospital for her surgery. And she had to go to Edmonton, which was a long drive, for treatments, for radiation treatments, because that was the closest place there was. So when that was happening, we lived close to my grandma and grandpa. They just lived up the hill. And sometimes one of the gals from town would come and stay with us. One time my Uncle Jack stayed with us, which was another story. But anyway, that was a sad time. But Mom went to Edmonton, and then she would come back with my dad. And we didn't know. We just knew that cancer was a bad thing, but people didn't like to talk about cancer in those days.
No.
And so it was something that you just kind of didn't talk about and hoped that it would go away, I guess, at least for children. And anyway, I gather that they told my mom that if you survived the first 5 years, you were cured. Well, I was 5 when my mom got cancer, and I was 10 when she died. So, and I wasn't living in the same little town anymore. But she had to go into the hospital for a year before she died. And my dad was still traveling, and so he wasn't home. But my mother's younger sister quit her job in Edmonton and came to stay with us while Mom was in the hospital. Well, then my mother died a year later, and so my Auntie Ruby stayed on. And eventually, 2 years later, she married my dad.
How did you feel about that?
We loved her. We were the luckiest kids in the world. We didn't know whether we should call her, what we should call her, but it was. And 2 years later, they had my baby sister, and then 2 years after that, they had my baby brother. So, and we were just a happy family. We really, really were.
When were you quarantined? Because that was an interesting story.
Yes. Well, we were quarantined. I had scarlet fever, which was a 2-week quarantine. And I don't even know if anybody gets scarlet fever anymore, but it was a rash, and it was a serious illness.
Yeah.
And my brother Dave got chicken pox at the same time. So they put signs on the doors and windows and nobody could go in or out. And so my dad, when he came home from his stay, his travels, would come to the front door and talk to Mom. And then he would go and stay in a hotel. When we got better, that was great. And I remember her saying at the time that how lucky we were because we had this person to stay. The following year, my mom was in the hospital. And that's when I think there's a story of us going to see her in the hospital.
Yes, it is.
And asking if she was coming home for Christmas, well, she didn't. Yeah.
Sad time.
It was, but we were so lucky because we had family around us. And I do remember when that happened that my both grand sets of grandparents were there when my mom passed away, and I could hear them talking about who's going to look after Dave and Joan. When somebody said, well, we can take Joan and somebody else. And I remember my dad getting upset and pounding the table and saying, nobody is splitting up my kids.
God bless him.
And I don't know what he had in mind, but Auntie Ruby came along.
Yeah. So there are absolutely wonderful stories in this book of yours, but there are also lovely poems. Would you mind reading this one, The Image of Me?
Mm-hmm. I have gazed into the mirror, and the face that looks at me is a face that's seen a lot of life. I hope there's more to see. But inside, I'm climbing mountains, swimming rivers, fishing streams, holding babies, loving lovers, making plans to fulfill dreams. Don't you know that what you see is just a carton holding me? Slightly ragged on the edges, torn in spots and losing shape. But it's me. I am still in there. When you see me, don't just gape. I'm a daughter, giggling schoolgirl, then a fiancée and wife, then a mother, teaching babies how to navigate through life. And throughout the life, there is the wondrous joy of friends, making every day much better. Oh, I hope it never ends. And late at night, when I'm in bed, reality creeps in and listens as I say a prayer, tucks my quilt beneath my chin, and as my eyes close sleepily, I just can't help but grin.
I can't believe that the time has just flown. I've just got a very quick question. You're 90. What else do you want to be doing?
I just want to keep doing what I'm doing. I just want to have friends, play cards,
Golf?
Golf, yes. Not well, but we still call it golf. Have a cocktail hour, which is quite a regular thing at my house.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us. It's just been so delightful. Thank you.
Well, and it's delightful meeting you, Veronique, and I knew your name.
Thank you. There are so many things that we haven't had time to talk about, but the book is From Prairie Roots to Lake Erie Shores, My Story in My Words, and it is an absolutely charming, charming book, and I would suggest you read it. That's all for this edition of Scribes and Songsters. A very big thank you to my guest, Joan Harder. Thanks also to our producer, our team, producer Liz Pettypiece-Phillips, technical producer and editor Gary Glass, social media manager Michelle Fortier, and consultant producer Brian Sweet. Grateful thanks to Tony Toldo and the Toldo Foundation, and to Neil and Tina Queering for their support. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you soon, right back here on Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. Bye for now.